So, what do you do when you are in a position of privilege or when you have some advantage over others? Last year, when I was taking out the food offering that we make after lunch every day, we put together some soiled bread that we offer to hungry ghosts. And I was bringing out this offering out to the platform where we place it across from the meditation hall. And already there were a number of turkeys waiting there. And when I put the food offering there and stepped back, to my surprise, one of the alpha turkey hen flapped her wings, right, and jumped onto the platform. And then she tossed a few scraps of bread to the other turkeys, who proceeded to rush over and start fighting over the bread. And then the alpha hen just stayed on the platform and started to eat. And I just stood there watching her and thinking, how much bread can one bird eat? A lot. And I was wondering, is she ever going to share the rest? No. So this one bird on the platform ate all the bread, right, and tossed a few scraps to the rest. And that was really, I was like in horror watching this. I think because I felt like I was watching myself. Like such a big part of my life has been about competing to be number one, right? The person with the best grades, the best opportunities, the best job, the best salary, the best, best, best. And what's the ripening result? You become the alpha turkey. Maybe in your next life, your mind is filled with attachment, a lot of arrogance, and you're blind to what the feelings and needs of others are. So that really stayed in my mind. And recently I was reading this article published in the Atlantic journal last fall, and the title was Power Causes Brain Damage. And it was looking at, psychological studies of how apparently being in powerful positions makes people less likely to empathize with others. And, the whole premise of the article was wondering, why people in high positions, like CEOs, who maybe started out from a very humble position or, they've been through the rock tumbler, paid their dues, why is it when they reach the top, they seem to just stop empathizing with people, they seem disconnected from their staff, and they wind up doing very unfortunate things like taking bribes or abusing their power, right? Now, what I really took from that article was it pointed out that power is not just a position, it's a mental state. Because I think they did experiments where they had students feel powerful and then look at their responses to other people after that. So from a Buddhist perspective, it made me think, well, this article is just talking about what happens when our mind is overwhelmed by affliction. In this case, ignorance, arrogance, and attachment. And I think that's very human in our experience. So I was thinking also, what are the antidotes to this, right? How do we start to counteract the behavior that happens when we are in some slight position of privilege or advantage and feeling powerful? How do we catch that, right, and make sure that our minds don't get overwhelmed? And I think last week, Venerable already pointed to a very simple thing we can do when we're in relation with others. And she was referencing Jackson Katz, his video, right? He's a sociologist talking about how men can speak up in situations where women are being denigrated. And he extends that too to whenever you're in any group of dominance, how you can adopt what he calls the bystander approach, right? That first of all, if we are even aware that maybe we're in a position of advantage, we can find ways to use it with wisdom and kindness. And the example he gave was, you're with a dominant group of people and maybe people from another group are not even present, but unpleasant remarks are made about another group. And you can at that moment interrupt and say, hey, I'm not comfortable when we speak like this about others, or surely we can do better than this. I mean, we don't have to speak so unkindly about others. Yeah, things like that. So I think that's one way we already start to bring awareness to ourselves and others, like, hey, maybe we have some advantages or privilege here, and start to see how we can use that in a responsible or wise or kind way. And for me, I used to do that when I heard Venerable talk about this and when I listened to Jackson Katz's talk. He does point out it takes a lot of courage to do this. and a lot of self-reflection. I used to do this with a lot of anger. I think that was the main problem. I used to be like a vegetarian on the soapbox kind of thing, where my family basically told me, could you just shut up and eat your veggies? We don't want to hear about cruelty to animals at this meal, right? Or I've had friends too say to me, gosh, why do you care so much about these low-wage workers? Could we just talk about something relaxing? So kind of being on the self-righteous soapbox wasn't cutting it. I was also the kind of English teacher where in my classroom you could not make racist or what do you call it, homophobic statements. I would just stop the whole class and make sure we discuss this issue. But I think what happened was the kids basically took that language elsewhere. They just knew it was out of bounds in the classroom. So when I heard this, I just thought, yeah, it takes a tremendous amount of skill just to even be aware of and start calling these things out or interrupting these moments that happen in everyday life. But, I'm glad people like Jackson Katz are holding workshops to give us those skills. And maybe for me internally, it was important to start working with the anger so that it wasn't coming out in my interactions with people. But I think that's where we start. Just recognizing, are these situations where I have privilege and an advantage? Am I arrogant or blinded in some way as a result? And what am I going to do with that? How am I going to use this with kindness and wisdom? And I think in terms of how to use it, because, remember in Jackson Katz's talk, he says, this is not about sensitivity training, right? He said, it's leadership training. Part of me wondered, is he just saying that to appeal to men, right, who maybe don't want to be sensitive, they want to be leaders? But I think he's calling on people to acknowledge the privilege and to see how to use it wisely. That's leadership, right? I think that's what he's calling leadership. So we can think about it in that way too. Because I also read an article about how if we give away the article was arguing that you can't actually give away privilege, right? So sometimes you are born into certain situations, and if you imagine you can give it away, that's kind of naive, or maybe you wind up ignoring the fact that you have the privilege. It's not something you can pretend is not there. So maybe the idea of exercising leadership with wisdom, with kindness, with compassion is another way to think of it. But at the same time, this idea of giving it away still resonates with me because a lot of heroes, I would say, in my personal life are people who have given away their privilege. Or maybe we say exercise that privilege to benefit others. So I'll give you a couple of examples that I always turn to when my mind gets, kind of in a difficult place. I turn to examples of hope, right? Whether in our faith or outside of it. One person I've admired for a long time is someone named Dr. Paul Farmer. They've made a documentary about him and his work, and it came out last year. I'm trying to figure out how we can get access to it. But basically, he grew up in a working class family, and he earned 2 degrees from Harvard. I think one as a doctor and one as a doctor, and one as a medical anthropologist. And what he did with these 2 PhDs was he went to Haiti in the 80s just to volunteer. And when he saw that poor people were getting turned away from hospitals, they had completely treatable diseases. They just couldn't afford to go to a hospital, and the hospitals would turn them away. That just completely broke his heart. And so he decided to dedicate his life to bringing healthcare to the world's poor. Because to him, he saw these drugs are available everywhere, and they're just not being given to people because of this kind of systemic injustice. So, he wanted to use his skills in this way. And what I thought was so incredible was that he and his friends went about this in not just like once off, we'll build one hospital in one place, but they even went so far as to start challenging policies at the World Health Organization, saying like, hey, why don't you make these drugs available to the poor? What makes you think it's not sustainable? Is there bias going on here? Right? And really challenging that and trying to show the WHO how it was possible to make generic drugs available and how you can train community health workers in the most difficult and poor environments to make these treatments sustainable. So he and his friends set up an organization called Partners in Health that continues to help many, many communities around the world. So, just seeing how he put all these skills to good use, he never was cynical or despairing. Yeah, and sometimes did unorthodox things to get drugs where they needed to be. Yeah, gave me a lot of inspiration. I think too about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, of course, who might be maybe the only political leader who has given away his position, right? When in the past, where he used to be both the spiritual leader and the political leader of the Tibetan people, he decided this was not viable in the modern times. He thought it made more sense to split the two, right? To have the spiritual leader be one position and then the political leadership be devolved to a democratic institution. How he actively built that institution, and it was a peaceful transition of power. Yeah. And how amazing that was, that he was wielding this power and privilege with a lot of long-term care for his community. Yeah. And of course, closer to home, our own teacher, Venerable Children, we can see that in her living example, how she has walked away from a life of a lot of privilege and chosen to dedicate her life to the Three Jewels and to establish a monastery. Not a single cent that people offer to her goes into her own pocket. It comes to the Abbey. And everybody who comes to the Abbey benefits from that generosity. So yeah, so these are just some thoughts I had on how to work with this idea of being in a position of privilege or having some advantage. It's easy to look outwards and get upset, right, when we see, hey, people in privilege don't, who have that privilege don't seem to be using it well. Yeah. But I think it's common across all sentient beings. I think watching the turkeys helped me to understand that. This is just how we are as sentient beings. When we get to the top, our minds are overwhelmed by ignorance and attachment. And that's when we can start to hold ourselves and others in those positions with compassion. And at the same time, call for accountability, both from ourselves and others. Right? Because otherwise, you just wind up becoming a turkey again and again, right? I mean, so what if you're an alpha turkey for 500 lifetimes? Is that what you really want? Yeah. So even if we can't change the turkey or that other person that we're frustrated with, we can at least look at ourselves for a start. For those moments where we might have a different, just a position that's in privilege in relation to others, even if we just have a skill that others don't have, how do we use that opportunity and how can we use that to benefit others and to create the causes for not just ourselves to have that good opportunity, but for others to have it as well.